Thanks, Bill. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really delighted to have been invited to present to you this afternoon and to make my small contribution to your thinking the way forward, because, of course, the demographic changes that we are facing are just going to change absolutely everything in the way you do business. Now, if I can just find the bits and pieces that I need here, and we'll move on. Okay, so when I first began learning about demography, is this echoing? Is this okay? Okay. Okay. When I first began learning about demography, we were of course working with Paul Ehrlich's population bomb and population explosion stories about how humanity would never survive because of its growth and so on. And the sort of textbooks that I use today are the one that you can see there, The End of World Population Growth in the 21st Century. So my presentation is really very much about the context in which you're making your thinking, doing your thinking about the future. And I'm going to just try and paint this picture for you, beginning with this overview of the big picture and then drilling down and having a little look at the Bay of Plenty and your territorial authorities. One of the things in trying to join the dots, and I see this like a jigsaw puzzle, you know, we don't know the answers, it's the future, we don't really know, we can't really know, but when we do our projections and we know where we've come from demographically, we can also see where we're going. Within a narrow frame of error. One of the things that is not helping is what we would call the big or small population discourse. How big, and I've just spent these 15 years in Australia where of course it's all about, you know, whether to have a big population or a small population, by how much we should grow and so on. What I'm going to talk about is what one of my colleagues in Australia, Don Rowland, has called the inconvenient truth about population ageing, and that is that it contains within it the end of growth. And this is something that we absolutely have to get used to. And I hope that by the end of my presentation you'll understand what I mean. And I don't want anybody to go and jump off the bridge this afternoon, because I know that many people are addicted to growth or believe that growth is the only way forward. Pleased to tell you that the Bay of Plenty will continue to grow, and over the next, as many of you would know, over the next 20 years projected to grow by about a further 14–15%. But as I'll be explaining, 90% of that growth will be at the 65 plus age group, 90%. Only Tauranga will have Tauranga City will have less than half of its growth over the age of 65. The other TAs of your region, all of the growth will be over the age of 65, and all of them will see declines at age 0 to 64. These are really profound shifts, and you have to build them into your thinking. So while on the one hand we have still some growth, it is actually what we call ageing-driven growth. And ageing-driven growth, as I'll explain, is absolutely different to the past when I was born, right at the start of the baby boom, when we had youth-driven growth. So that's the overview, and I thought I would start with New Zealand Institute of Economic Research's suggestion of a population by 15 million by 2061, because I seem to have spent a lot of time responding to inquiries about this. How good would it be, how bad would it be, where would they live and so on, but there's not really a question about could it be achieved. So I just want to share this with you at the start, and if you read the report you would see that the authors actually make the point that most of their projections are basically impossible and couldn't be done, so please put it out of your head that this is a possibility. If we were to assume the total fertility rate remaining at 2.1 births per woman, which is the number you need to replace the population, push life expectancy up to 95 years by 2061, which is Statistics New Zealand's highest assumption, increase our annual net migration gain to 100,000, which is 4 times Stats New Zealand's highest projection, or 8 times its medium. Keep the age structure of the migrants very youthful and migration positive at all ages, which is going to be difficult because I'm going to tell you that globally population, or at least across the more developed countries where we want to get our migrants from, over the next 20 years there will be 41 million fewer of them. The 2061 population would be 10.8 million, and 22% would be over the age of 65. So you can see the problems ahead. To get a population of 15 million by 2061, we'd have to bring in over 150,000 net migration per year, keep fertility at replacement level, or else get the birth rate to return to baby boom levels, about 3.5 births per woman, and bring in 100,000 migrants a year. So you see the issues. And these are all spelled out in the report. It's just a pity that most people don't actually read the detail. What that report doesn't talk about is really the reality of population ageing and what it actually does. So this is basically the story. As I've said, ageing-driven growth is not the same as youth-driven growth. Over the next, well, I say 20 years, but now we're in 2013, by 2021, New Zealand's population on the medium case projections, which include a net migration gain of 12,000 a year, which is actually quite hard to get. Currently we're about minus 3,000. The population will grow by just under 9%. By 2031, grow by just under 18%, but you see that growth is almost all at the older ages. Just a little bit with a rather positive assumption about net migration being positive over the young adult ages there, giving a bit of growth in those young adult ages. We've got to move it on. The point that I made before is that ageing-driven growth is finite. So here's the same data, just to put some big numbers around it. That 9% growth by 2021, 65 plus years, the population grows by 40%. All other age groups combined, 0 to 64, will grow by just 4%. And to 2031, that 18% growth, the population 65 plus, of which I'm about to join, 88% growth, all other age groups combined, just 7%. Over the next 20 years, 2/3 of New Zealand's growth is projected to be at 65 plus years. So everything that I say later about what's happening in the Bay of Plenty and in your territorial authorities, you need to remember that that's what's going on all around you in New Zealand, more so in some areas, because actually the Bay of Plenty is sort of middle-aged in the scale of things in New Zealand. And it's going on very much around the world. So just to look a peek ahead, figure I referred to before, 58 more developed countries, all future growth at 65 plus years. So between now and 2021, 3% growth overall, potentially. 65 plus population grows by 25%. All other age groups combined decline by a little. But out to 2031, probably about 4.5% growth, 98 million 65 plus year olds added to that population, and all other age groups combined declining by 41 million. Now that's the context in which we're going to be fighting for our migrants, our young migrants, and our young people are as of much interest to other countries as their young people are to us. So, you know, we really have to work hard at keeping, or at least encouraging our young people, perhaps go and do your OE and come back. People need to know these things. Across the New Zealand's 67 territorial authorities, over 1/3 are already declining, have been since 1996. Between 2011 and 2031, all growth in 84% will be at 65 plus years. All other age groups, 0 to 64 projected to decline. The same sort of picture I was just showing you for the more developed countries. 23 of those TAs are expected to experience overall decline, and as I just said, there's 1/3 already in decline, and there'll be some changing of the guard, so some will come very slightly out of decline and others will go into it. But as we transit this cusp from overall growth, which we had in the wonderful baby boom years, to the end of growth coming as the older population, the baby boomers move into the older ages and are followed by much smaller cohorts born since, then we see a great number of our TAs moving into that point at which there is no more potential for growth. Of the remaining 11 TAs, and these are the only ones where all growth won't be at 65 plus years, 2 of them only 95% of their growth will be at 65 plus. That's good news for Christchurch and Whangarei. Three of them, Waikato, Palmerston North and Waimakere, 15 years in Australia, I tell you. We'll have between 60 and 63% of their growth at 65 plus. Another three, including Tauranga, the city, 44 to 46% of your growth at 65 plus. And just three, Bob, where are you? Auckland, of course, Hamilton and Queenstown, with a third of their growth at 65 plus. So you see the incredibly profound and extensive nature of these changes. And I've got a table coming up which it's got lots of numbers on it, but I'll explain it to you as we go just to show you how that differs from the past. So why do we know these things are happening? How can I stand up here and say that the end of growth is nigh? I always want to, get one of those sort of billboards to carry around. So we break population ageing up into 4 dimensions. First, we have numerical ageing, and that's the absolute increase in the number of elderly. It's primarily caused by more people living longer. Locally, like in places like Western Bay of Plenty, particularly Tauranga, it's caused by in-migration of older retirees. Structural ageing is those increased numbers at the older ages become an increase in the proportion, but only because their children and grandchildren haven't had children to the same extent as the older population did. So what we have is declining fertility causes the base of your age structure to come in and the increased numbers at the top to become a larger proportion. Locally, also Western Bay of Plenty and Kaurau, Aporiki, Whakatane lose young adults, and so that makes your median age go up faster. So the more you lose your young adults, of course, you also lose the reproductive potential because they don't have their kids. They're not there to have their kids. What people haven't really cottoned on to, or maybe just slowly starting to, and I know I talk to lots of local governments who are starting to get a bit concerned about this. Once you have more elderly than children in your population, it's approximately 10 years until you reach the point of no more natural growth. So you have more elderly than children and then more deaths than births. And this is just a natural outcome of the ageing of the population. But then, of course, there's another step, and that is absolute decline, the actual end of growth and beginning of decline as indicated in that book cover that I put up first, because there is insufficient migrants coming in to replace either the lost births or the increased deaths. Okay, so it's a 4-stage process, and the work that I've been doing over the last 15 years in Australia and the 3 years since I got back here show me that you can track this, and I'll be talking about that in a moment. You can get a handful of indicators and you can see when each TA, for example, crosses a line. It may come back the next year or the next year, but it'll go back over again. Once you pass certain thresholds, you're well on your way to the end of growth, and this will be permanent. They're the third of New Zealand's TAs, as I said, already experiencing absolute decline, and among them, of course, Kaurau and Aporiki. Does it matter? Well, some of my esteemed colleagues, Coleman and Rowthorne from Britain, argued in a rather interesting paper, because on the one hand they were laying out all the problems and the consequences of population ageing, it's called. They said that subnational decline is devoid of strategic importance unless it's accompanied by decline at the national level. Now, as I'm sure that Sir Bob was telling you this morning, most of New Zealand's growth is in Auckland. So on the one hand, New Zealand keeps growing, but it's really only Auckland, or only a few parts. Bit in the Bay of Plenty, I've got a slide coming up, Waikato, Wellington and Otago. But I would say that they're very wrong. And this sort of, again, these sort of statements don't really help us to understand what's happening, especially for you people who are actually dealing with it. Population ageing is not something that occurs at the national level. It happens in the local areas. That's where it's being played out, where some areas already have, vastly more older than people than young. I would say that the end of growth subnationally matters very much to those who own the houses and the businesses. And as a person who lives in Morrinsville, I'm not that happy to see to imagine what's going to happen to my house price if I hang on to it for very much longer as these trends unfold. Matters to people who employ people and provide all those services, because you have to plan ahead. You have to be building infrastructure for a population that will only be there for maybe 20 to 30 years. Matters very much to you councils. It matters to your regional neighbours. So while, for example, Tauranga might be going to grow massively, the rest of the areas, it matters very much to them. It matters to the rest of us that Auckland grows so much and is able to command so many resources. I'm sure it matters to your ratepayers, and ultimately it matters to the whole country. New Zealand's growth, future growth, will be very uneven. Auckland currently taking around 60% of the annual growth. It's projected to go up to closer to 70%. And you see there the few regions which are projected to still get growth, mainly Waikato, Bay of Plenty, Wellington and Canterbury. The others share a very small amount of growth. So I call here on my another esteemed author, C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills, a wonderful sociologist, and what he said is, he said that if in a population of 100,000 people, one man is unemployed, then that's his personal trouble, and for its resolution we look to the man. If in a population of 100,000, 20,000 are unemployed, that's an issue. And for its resolution, we don't look to the people, but we look to the structures. And I've converted that and said, when one local government area declines, that's its personal trouble. For its resolution, we look to the council and we vote them out. I vote. When all local councils begin to decline, and for a very new reason, and I'll explain that in a moment, that's an issue. And for its resolution, or for its management, because we can't resolve it, we must look to central government, which needs to put regional ageing and the end of growth on its agenda, and I don't hear anything much about that. So the new minister, I'm sure, will be interested to hear these things. Touching down then in the Bay of Plenty, whoops, come on. Okay, so as I said, Bay of Plenty is around the middle of the age structure in terms of the national picture, but somewhat older than total New Zealand. Third oldest regional council, but projected to be the 7th oldest in 2031. Currently, Bay of Plenty has got about 16% over the age of 65 compared to 13.3 New Zealand. By 2031, it's projected to have 25% over the age of 65 compared to just 21% for total New Zealand. And you see there on the slide on the right, got this thing called an internal momentum of decline. In the 1950s and 60s, when we had the baby boom, the age structure was like a pyramid, and that was an internal momentum of growth. Lots more children than elderly. And what's happening is simply age structures are tipping upside down, and there you see by 2031 we're moving into that stage where you have fewer children than elderly, and those are around the point where we start to look at the end of growth, the end of natural growth. So the Bay of Plenty is projected to have slightly lower overall growth rates than total New Zealand, but the changes by age are similar to elsewhere. That same little bit of growth in those middle young adult age groups, and nearly all of that destined, or at least projected, for Tauranga City itself. The Bay of Plenty is a significant ageing-driven growth region, so that's nearly 7% out to 2021, 37% say at 65 plus years. All other age groups combined are projected to grow by just 1%. Value them, because they're really important. Between now and 2031, that 14% growth for the region. The population 65 plus is projected to grow by 80%. All other age groups combined, barely 2%. Now, these are the medium case projections. If I was brave and went with the Stats New Zealand High projections, which have a net migration gain of 15,000 a year over all the country, it doesn't change those ratios. it means you get just about 2% growth over the period out to 2021, and the 65 plus population grows by even more because it has also a higher life expectancy assumption. So it doesn't change, you're not going to change this imbalance that is unfolding. I had something else there, yeah. I said at the start, 90% of this region's growth will be at 65 plus years. Move on. So you'll have more elderly than children in approximately 8 years. This crossover has already occurred in about 15% of the regions of the country's territorial authorities, and the crossover is projected for total New Zealand around 2026. So as I said before, once you cross over to more elderly than children, it's around 10 years on every piece of work that I've ever seen to reaching that point of moving into natural decline. So you can potentially be looking at just 18 to 20 years to moving into natural decline. Now, the projections don't show that because they have a very positive migration scenario built into them, but so it may stretch out a year or two either way, but that's the overall picture that you're going to be looking at. Huge amount of diversity within your region, of course, and again, I'm sure most of you, being local councils and so on, will know this even better than I. But there you see on the left, Tauranga, as it was in 2011, with the New Zealand age structure in the unshaded bars and behind there, and so you can just see how Tauranga itself has more people. If I can get this thing here working. Yes, more, just you can see the unshaded bars and behind there, and the slight overlay of the women at the top there, quite a few more older people in this region. Rotorua, on the other hand, 12.3% over the age of 65, so it's somewhat younger, but it's got a quite different shape. And then you go, look at Western Bay of Plenty with that extreme hourglass. Now, these hourglass age structures are really an issue that you have to be watching because, I mean, you can almost recognise people in the middle there. But you know, you can see what's happening. You've got more older people moving into the region, young adults moving out. With the young adults leaving, of course, you don't get the children. Even if you got the birth rate up more, you're still not going to have sufficient mums and dads to have the number of children you need to offset the end of growth. I'll show you a little bit more about that one in a moment. And Whakatane with, Bay of Plenty with 17.8% over the age of 65, more or less, and Whakatane with about 14%. Now these, there are different dynamics driving these, as I mentioned, and I'll just try and explain this one for Western Bay of Plenty. There's the actual number that was enumerated at the 2001 census at each age, so quite a major deficit around the 20 to 24 year age group. We then do a little exercise where we survive that population. We add in the new births and we survive the population using life expectancy or survival rates at each age, and we work out how many we would expect to have 5 years later. That's the pink line. And then we compare it to the actual population that was enumerated in 2006, and of course the gap between what you expected and what you got gives you a residual measure of migration by age. And so you can see that you got the Western Bay of Plenty had a net migration gain at younger ages as it did at these older ages, and that little gain at the younger ages is of course the kids of the people of working age that came in with them. So every time you get a gain of young working age people, it's good because you get your kids as well. But of course had a net migration loss at 15 to 24. So very important to understand that each of your TAs, I mean, they could even look identical, but they can have quite different dynamics, and I call this forensic demography. The students love it because you can start to break it up also by ethnicity or by labour force status and all sorts of things and get quite a handle on what's been going on in a region. But just important to understand that sometimes I look at an age structure that's got an hourglass shape and I simply think immediately, oh, that's the loss of young 20 to, say, 15 to 24-year-olds, 15 to 29-year-olds. But actually in Bay of Plenty, Western Bay of Plenty's case, it's actually both that and then the addition at the younger and older ages, which gives it that extreme hourglass shape. And that shape is hugely important for delivering services, for raising revenue, for deciding the sort of businesses that you want in your region and so on, or for people making decisions about moving in. So your overall change projected ahead is expected to be very uneven by territorial authority, with Tauranga, you see there the numbers aren't really that important, although if you're addicted to growth they will be. For Tauranga City, the projection between say 2011 2016 for about 5,900, that goes down a bit, and then 2016 2021 goes up to about 10,000 in that period, 10,000 the following 5 years, 10,200 and then 10,000. But the purple shaded areas show you where the population is already declining or projected to decline. And as I say, one of the reasons is because of population ageing. It's not just the movement of people, not just migration of young people moving out looking for jobs. I'm going to try and explain that here. So if you don't like numbers, you can close your eyes. And I'll just, it goes back to one of the first points that I was making. If we look along, if you've got your eyes open, if we look along the bottom line there, the Bay of Plenty between 1996 and 2011 grew by about 20%. 67% of the growth was 0 to 64 and 33% was 65 plus. But over the next 20 years, only 10% will be at 0 to 64, and that 90%, as I said before, will be at 65 plus. And so going to the top line for Tauranga City, which of course does quite well out of all this, between 1996 and 2021, 79% of the growth of that, it grew by 45%. That's huge growth. 79% was at 0 to 64 and 21% was at 65 plus. Going forward 20 years, 54% will be at 0 to 64, 46% will be at 65 plus. But if you look at all the others, and you don't need to take the numbers in as much as understand that going forward on that darker coloured panel to the right there, each of those TAs has declines at all younger ages, 0 to 64, and the growth is all at the older ages. So it's a profound change, and one that you're going to have to build into all of your planning. But my cloud up there says there might be a silver lining, so we'll get to it eventually. We also need to refine our analytical frameworks, and this is what I was referring to before about the new reason for decline. The old pattern of subnational decline or population loss of any age was usually due to the net migration loss, more leaving than coming in, exceeding the natural increase, more births than deaths. The new pattern will be both the net migration loss plus the natural decline as it comes online, as it systematically comes online, as populations have more elderly than children, more deaths than births, they go into natural decline, and they will also be having net migration loss. And so it's a double whammy situation, and it means that this is almost impossible to pull out of. Now, I got the title of Dr. Doom and Gloom when I started talking about this in Tasmania about 15 years ago, but they eventually got the idea. And this is the future, but it doesn't have to be negative. Like, you guys are going to be driving this, and I say that to my students all the time, you know, you people will make the decisions and the policies about how we'll go forward and what we'll do. First, we have to just break that addiction to growth and understand that in some areas there will be growth, but in a lot of areas there'll be decline or the end of growth, and we've got to look for all the positives in it. And I've mentioned before, there's some critical midway thresholds. I won't go into it too much. I've mentioned that before. When you lose your young people, you accelerate your structural ageing because you lose their reproductive potential, and when you gain older people, they don't have that many kids, and so they also exacerbate the structural ageing. It's a long but clearly signposted journey. I mentioned that these ageing indicators that you can use to look at it, thresholds that precede the end of growth, so we don't just wait until we see the New Zealand population reach the end of growth, probably around about 2070, 2080, and all of that growth occurring in Auckland, pretty much. but we can track it and anticipate what it might mean for us. And we see these are some of the thresholds. We see shrinkage in our working age population. We see a reducing labour market entry-exit ratio of young people to those in the retirement zone, increasing ratio of elderly to children, shrinking reproductive age population, and of course a reducing in the end of natural increase. And they unfold more or less sequentially, and we don't see any permanent reversals. So just to give you an idea how that's looking, just 3 slides illustrating them, the percentage of territorial authorities across New Zealand that already have fewer labour markets, that have fewer labour market entrants, 15 to 24, to those 55 to 64. Now, we know that those boundaries are going to change, but these are International Labour Organisation definitions. So in 1996, only 7% of the TAs across the country had fewer labour market entrants and exits, and one of them was Western Bay of Plenty. By 2011, that was almost 36%, or just over a third. But that's going to really leap up now, because you know what's happening, and you know it all around you. The older baby boomers, or the baby boomers, are starting to retire, and even if they don't retire, because I don't think any of us actually know about the R word, but we're going to change what we do, and we're going to do it differently and have not quite as tough work days and so on. We'll change the way we do things. What's going to happen over the next 5 years is that increasingly those baby boomers will start to trickle out of the labour market, and there will be, over the next 5 years, 20,000 fewer school leavers in New Zealand, and the following 5 years there'll be a further 8,000 fewer school leavers. So that's what we've got to deal with before the current baby blip that's just recently been born actually gets useful and arrives at labour market entry age. And so we're going to see this huge jump. By 2016, around about 2/3 of our local government areas will have fewer labour market entrants and exits, and that has got to be a demographically tight labour market with implications for labour costs and just general availability. The thing is, you might have a big excess of youth in Auckland, but you can't get them to Gore on a daily basis. It's a bit difficult. So in this next 5 years, Tauranga City, Opotiki and Whakatane are projected to have fewer people at 15 to 24 than 55 to 64. The following 5 years, Rotorua and Kaurau will join them. And by that time, 84% of New Zealand's TAs will have fewer labour market entrants and exits. So it's not something that you're doing wrong or doing by yourself. It's happening everywhere, and that's why labour supply will be very difficult. The working age population declining. That's the sort of classic 15 to 64-year-old population. Around 1996, a bit over half of the TAs had their working age populations declining, and then between 2001 and 2006 we had quite good migration, so the number dropped. Between 2006 and 2011, that jumped up a little bit to 28% again, and Kaurau and Opotiki joined them. Between now and 2016, or by 2016, 79% of the TAs in the country will have shrinking working age populations, and by 2021, Whakatane and Rotorua will have joined them, and 5 years later, Western Bay of Plenty will have joined them. And again, you see that you're getting to that point of 80-odd% of the TAs in this situation, the only ones not in it being Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, Christchurch, maybe Tauranga for a while. More elderly than children, and this is the one that demographers tend to track when they're looking at the end of growth, where you get this more elderly than children, more deaths and births. 1996, none of our TAs had more elderly than children. By 2011, it was about 16%. By 2016, it will be about 40%, including Western BOP and Tauranga. By 2021, 61%, including Opotiki. By 2026, 76%, and by 2031, 91% of New Zealand's TAs will have more elderly than children. Rotorua joining them. So just a few thoughts in closing on the labour market implications of structural ageing as well. I know your planning isn't so much about labour market, but you know, if you look around your workmates, you're going to find that these pictures look pretty much like what a lot of your workplaces do as well. What are some of the implications? Bay of Plenty's horticulture and fruit growing industry in 1996 had 26% over the age of 55. By 2006, it had 39% over the age of 65, and you can see how these big cohorts have been moving up. And the question is, who is going to buy these farms? Because this picture is replicated all across the country. And who are going to buy the houses? What you see there's some little numbers there. In 1996, there were 4 people aged 15 to 29 in those industries, compared to every 10 in 55 plus. By 2006, that had dropped to 2 aged 15 to 29 for every 10 55 and over. Huge changes. Who will be there to pick us up when we get sick in our hospitals? Come on. Here's your Bay of Plenty hospitals and nursing homes. In 1996, there were just under 12% over the age of 55. By 2006, that was 22%, and I'm only imagining what it's going to look like when we finally get the census coming out at the end of the year. In 1996, it meant that there were 6 people aged 15 to 29 working in that area for every 10 and 55 plus. By 2006, that had dropped to 2. The same in every region. Who will teach our kids in our schools? This is for the Bay of Plenty's primary and secondary school teachers, and again, you see how it's aged. The point I'm just wanting to get across is that every industry that we look at, except, say, retail and a few of the trades which have particularly youthful age structures, nearly all of the rest look like this, and that's the competition that's going to be unfolding. But it's not just for employees, it's got implications for wages, implications obviously for investment in businesses and so on, and it's just got implications for everything. So the silver lining at the end, who are you going to call when these age structures tip upside down and you've got these fewer labour market entrants and then exits? Your young Māori population is sitting there poised to be one of the answers. I'm sure that you know these proportions, again, better than I for your particular region, but 25% of your population is Māori, but at 0 to 19, that's 35% of all children here. It's the same across New Zealand. 14% of the population is Māori. Well, it's not the same, it's similar, but 20% at the younger ages, 0 to 19 and around 20 to 24. Young Māori make up 1 in every 5. It's what I've called in a paper I published recently called the potential collateral demographic dividend. The demographic dividend happens when the age structure starts to tip upside down. So when fertility first starts to fall and the base of the age structure comes in, and you get this beehive shape, and it's a good shape, if you like, for the economy. It's why the Asian countries have done so well recently. It's a thing that the developing countries are looking at the moment, that the bulk of their working age population, it's the biggest because you've got diminishing numbers at the younger ages, but your increased numbers of older people haven't yet come through. It's a stage of the demographic transition, lasts for about 2 or 3 decades. Now, the Māori population, you see that median age, half of that population under the age of 23. For European, half the population's under the age of 39 or 40. That young Māori population has this collateral situation has huge potential advantages for Māori and also for the whole population if we all work together on it and recognise the potential that's there and invest wisely. I think that's about it. So the ABC of population ageing, ladies and gentlemen, and I find this really hard, it's about Alcoholics Anonymous. You've got to stand up there and say, I am addicted to growth. Accept that population ageing and the end of growth is coming to a local area near you. Keep your local constituency apprised of these changes. Don't keep promising growth. I mean, you might in Tauranga and Auckland, but the rest of it, it's like get them understanding the fact that you've got more grey hairs in your population and fewer children. Tell them what it actually means and ask them what they want to do about it as well. Look for those opportunities and the challenges, obviously, and not least the opportunities for Māori and with Māori, the whole country. Buffer. This is the United Nations in 2000, a wonderful publication called Replacement Migration, said that our populations will never become young again, that you will not change this demography. It's actually the end of a sort of a social evolution point. We're at that point. My colleagues in Japan, Natalie and Rausch, have shown that across Japan, they're about to close 430, I think, towns in the next 5 years because they can't provide services. Doesn't mean you can't live there, but they just can't provide, police forces and postal services and water and things like that. And the choices will increasingly narrow to whether to keep your town or my town going. And you can look at kaurau and start to think about these issues. Amalgamation, I know a lot of people hate it, but it is a B word. It is a buffer word. Buffer is about protecting against the worst things that are going to be delivered to you by population ageing and engaging with the opportunities. And the demographic gift that we still have with us, especially for Māori, that's a buffer thing as well. Remember that your local trouble is a national issue. It is not something you are doing wrong. In fact, if your population's ageing, you're actually just doing it right. I haven't talked about this at all, but fiscal equalisation policies, which are what they use in Australia, where you have a common pool, which means a common pool of funds, which local governments, if they happen to be older than average or have, say, higher proportions of day trippers or something like that, they can plea for some of these funds, and it's so that they can deliver services, equivalent services to other local governments, irrespective of their ability to actually raise that revenue, because they might have that particularly ageing population. And I've referred to Auckland and the rest, and I think it is an issue that has to be considered. And C is celebrate, that we know this is coming. We can proactively manage it. The end of population growth will probably be a good thing. We've spent so many years wringing our hands about, whether we're going to get to 10 billion or 11 billion. The figure that the United Nations, OECD, everybody's in agreement with is probably not much over 9 billion when we peak, around mid-century. And the ending of growth will have to have many advantages, but we have to find them. Don't ask me what they are, because it's about, we've got to all get around the table, and you need town planners and, people who provide health services and governments and everybody and a demographer to actually work it all out together. It means that we can collaborate, we must collaborate, we can conserve, and we can move to capital deepening, i.e. investing more in the people that we have instead of having to stretch our dollar across more and more people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie. We've probably got time for a couple of questions. Over here. We've got the microphones. Where are the microphones? There's one coming.
You can take questions at afternoon tea time anyway.
In the Western Bay Plenty, we have a lot of seasonal labour, so a town like Te Puke or Katikat's population may go up quite significantly, 20 to 30% for 6 months of the year. The census is taken in March. So if territorial authorities, central government, NZTA look at these figures, I think sometimes they may get the wrong impression unless you take account of the big increases in resources and services required to service the seasonal labour force. Thank you.
Well, that's right. Stats New Zealand, of course, they do a census night count, and then they reassign people by where their normal postcode is. So it's your usual resident population, the figures that we mostly work on. The ones that you're talking about then are the migrant workers who are in there, and they're usually picked up because they are down as a migrant, So the figures are refined, if you like, to accommodate some of that, but it doesn't resolve all the problem, because you have a similar problem to, say, Thames Coromandel, which has a huge population which doesn't actually live there, and So, you know, there are difficulties with the enumeration, but the Stats New Zealand do go to some length to tease them out and make sure that they've got people attributed to where they normally live. Yeah. Yes, and then they're subtracted from it. So if you look at your census night count, and then you look at the usual resident count, which comes out usually about 6 months later, you'll find that there's a significant difference in it. The same for like Auckland, the number of people going in each day. The figures that mostly we refer to, and these figures that I've been using, are usual resident population. So the people have been reassigned to where they would normally live. Does that... Not quite, but anyway.
Yeah, there was a question over here, please. Yeah. Over here.
Yes, Brian.
Two seconds, Brian, just a microphone behind you. There we go.
Yes, thank you very much. Very enlightening. Just a quick query. You've been dealing mainly with the macro figures, but within a territorial authority, for instance, Katikati at the moment is 37% over 65. And they're putting older people in there, and very soon it could be 50% over 65. So I approached the Productivity Commission and suggested they could bring some research fellows to Katikati to find out what life would be like and how a territorial authority should behave with those sort of figures. Now, there's 2 points from that. One, should they be doing that? Would you advise them to do that, or are they deliberately killing a town from what you're suggesting? Or B, should we have some research going on in Katikati?
You're absolutely right that we actually don't know very much about these things. That's what I said, but this future, we can see it with our data, our macro level data, if you like, but it doesn't tell us. I mean, we can go and look at our census data and look at how many of them came from another country, or you know what income or how many cars they had or something like that. But in terms of the qualitative type of research that we need to know how to deal with this, at this point we can really only look to other countries that are older. So if you've got 37% over the age of 65, the only sort of place you can compare yourself with is, you know, somewhere like Sweden, and it's such a different policy regime, welfare state, local government situation, all that. It's not going to help. Absolutely, you need research done. And I was going to say that it's very hard to get research funding to do this sort of thing. We're all trying, but actually, myself, Professor Jacques Poot, along with me, Paul Spoonley from Massey, and about 4 others, we were actually funded in the last round to actually go out and get some of this information over the next 3 years. So we're just starting on that project now. I don't know that Katikat's on our list though. Give me a call.
Time for one more. One more over here, please.
Kia ora, Peter Monteith. You referred earlier to the population blip, which from memory was around 2004 to 2006, when we had low unemployment, paid parental leave had just been introduced, and working for families. So, which some of us attributed to the government policies at that time, meant, and I think 20 hours free early childhood education was introduced, or signalled to be introduced as well at that time. Are you saying that it actually is impossible for government to, because I think that's an example of massaging it, maybe not changing it, but are you saying it is impossible for government to change this trend, or are there things that government, local and national, can do?
There's virtually nothing that governments can do. The primary reason for the baby blip that we've just seen, which, as you say, around 2004 to 2008, was also the size of the reproductive age cohort going through. The number of births that you get is the effect of the birth rate per woman times the number of women. And if you look at this, and I did the analysis for Australia as well, like you know, Peter Costello said one for you, one for your husband and one for the country. 3 months later, they actually...
What are you referring to exactly?
One kid. Okay, 3 months later, the Australian Bureau of Statistics recorded quite a sizable increase in the birth rate, and he took responsibility for it, which means that they were either very premature, but we had actually anticipated that about 6 or 7 years beforehand, showing that there would be the big cohort that was born in 1991, around 1991, would reach the point that it would start having children, the early childbearers. And it's a sort of a cohort effect, and then you've got the ones that put off having their kids until they were 34 or something and then delayed and started having them. Every country that has tried to do something about its birth rate, there has been no sustained effect from it. So I think you might get a little blip, unless you want to be like Romania and prevent people using contraception or something like that. There's no real way. And you know, New Zealand has the highest birth rate in the developed world. That's another thing to keep in mind. For us to buck the boat now, to get it up, imagine for every woman on average to have 2.1 children. That means every single woman having 2 kids. It's actually a big ask these days. So, probably not.
Natalie, thank you. Would you join with me, please, in thanking Professor Natalie Gates?